Okay, everybody, welcome to the TESOL Admitted Students event. And the purpose of today really is to sort of look a little bit closer at the program that you've decided to join, so that it's a little bit more, it's a little clearer in terms of what the sort of program covers. So as you'll see in a minute, I'm going to pull out 3 things, and hopefully they'll really help, as I said, for you to get to know the program. So as you know, I'm Lesley Painter-Farrell. I've interviewed you, so I feel like I know you really well. I'll be sort of working with you today along with...
I'm Claire Marinello, your current student ambassador, and neither of you's met me yet, so hi. I'm a current student, so I'm here to tell you a little more about my experience with the program. We apologize, we don't have a clicker, so we will be back and forth to tap the keyboard.
Okay then, so what we want to do today is, as I said, draw out 3 things, but begin with something else, which is very typical of the program. So what we need to do is know who we are today, why we're here, that's the most important thing. Feel free to ask questions at any point, because you might, as things move on, questions might arise. Then I want to really explore 3 areas of the program that I think are really important to know before you even begin study. Firstly, the content and the sort of contents orientation, because it has a very definite orientation. Then personalization, because I think that's something that often isn't evident from other grad programs or even sometimes our own, in terms of how can I make sure that this study obviously is productive for me, but also that I can personalize so that it works exactly for me and what I want to achieve during my time with us. And then finally, we'll look at experiential. We'll just talk a little bit about that because that's one of the cornerstones of the program. So how your study works with us and how we expect you will learn within the program. So Claire, I don't know if you want to add anything to that?
I will say that when I was here at Admitted Students Day 2 years ago, I was the only one who showed up. So we did this whole thing with no PowerPoints, just conversation. So, I know we're a little more formal today, but we're still going to have a conversation. So really do feel free to jump in.
Okay. So first of all, Heather, I've given you something which is very typical to the field, and you probably both know them, the Find Someone Who. So we'll do it, and then if you do it, if you know what to Find Someone Who is, it's a very typical thing within our field to get to know each other. And the reason I brought it today was because it is so typical within our field. And it also highlights something that's very important about our field, and that is how we get to know one another, how we believe in building a community. I think we've got a very strong community in the TESOL, and it's what we call a learning community. So it's not just a bunch of friends getting together, it's actually how we constructively work, how we feel safe with one another, how we ask questions of one another, which obviously means we're going to learn. So if we just take a few minutes to work on this together. So Claire, love to cook?
Love's a strong word. I did see a good movie last night.
Oh, which was?
Platoon.
Oh, the old one.
My family's on a crusade to see all the Best Picture winners.
Oh,
and that was
of all
Best Picture.
time.
Yeah, that was Best Picture in 1986. So.
Oh my gosh, that long ago. I actually did, but not last night, but while I was at IATEFL.
Mm-hmm. Since you just came from TESOL, I think you've been to the UK.
Exactly, definitely, yeah. And then know something about TESOL, I think you do.
Yeah, I was at the conference, so were you.
Yeah. And how was the presentation at the very end?
It was small. I think 5 p.m. on a Friday was a tough time
Tough time slot, yeah. But you did it.
Yes, we did.
Okay, then. And then has taught English before?
Obviously, both of us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. For how long have you been teaching?
I guess this is almost 6 years, but not necessarily continuously. I had some roles where I was more administrative.
Okay.
How long have you been teaching English total?
Ooh, okay, then I would say 30 years.
Okay.
Yeah, quite a long time.
Have you gone skydiving?
Never.
Me neither.
Can you recommend a good book?
Probably a lot of them.
Yeah, something that recent?
The most recent thing I read was probably Educated, which is
I've seen that.
Yeah.
I've got that on hold on my Overdrive account.
Yeah.
Good?
Yeah, it was pretty good. I got involved in an online book club that recommended it.
Oh, and online. I belong to a book club, but it's on the ground as opposed to online. Oh.
Yeah, I was online.
How does that work? How do you talk to one another?
We have a discussion board just like we do on Canvas.
Oh my gosh, that's really good. And what platform do you use?
It has like a name that's like a pun on the word library. I don't remember it off the top of my head.
And are they people from everywhere, or?
It was through my like undergrad alma mater's alumni association, so it's like people who ever graduated from Boston College, but that covers a lot of ground. So.
Okay then.
Hello, ladies. Hello. Does anyone love to cook? We haven't found anyone who loves to cook.
We did, Gabriella.
Oh,
Gabriella,
good.
you do?
Gabriella loves to cook. And
You're the only one.
Dan has indoor skydived before.
Indoor skydiving. What's that?
Oh.
With the giant
Yeah,
fan
like a
that pushes you
tube,
up.
and you went up and down and up and down. Does it feel the same?
Oh, well, yes, because you're sort of weightless, but you're not staring down thousands of feet.
Yeah,
It's a safe version.
That's a possibility. Yeah.
Jose can recommend a good book. He's currently reading 12 Rules of Life.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay.
12 Roles of Life.
Um,
By.
Jordan Peterson.
Oh, I'm going to try and find. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to guess. Have you taught English before?
Yes, I have. Have you guys taught yet?
Yes.
Okay, so most of our TESOL students have some experience on that level, but not everyone.
Lesley, do you know all the grammar structures on this?
I certainly do.
Good.
Do you want to name them?
I see present perfect.
Yeah. Present simple, simple past.
And we've got the modal verbs with can recommend.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And Claire, do you know something about the TESOL organization?
I do, actually. This year was my first trip to their international convention. Lesley and I were both there in Atlanta, Georgia. Really a great opportunity to learn about a lot that's going on in the world of English language teaching and research. Yeah.
Lesley, have you been to the UK?
I have. I got back last night.
Was just there.
Exactly right.
This week.
Awesome. Everything is.
I think that's it. Oh, I saw a good movie last night.
Oh, you did? Which
I
one?
did. I watched Dial M for Murder on TCM.
Okay.
Which was
Oh,
oldie-
the
an oldie,
old,
but a goodie.
old black
Alfred
and-
Hitchcock, Grace Kelly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good stuff. Okay. Vintage. Okay then, so this I think begins to highlight what I said before, and that is that there's a very strong community within the MA TESOL. I think, Claire, you've sort of seen it sort of function. It's not just continuing students, there's a lot of alumni, and we do many different things. We've got teacher talking time, which is every month.
Yes.
Which you've been to a few times,
Yeah.
I think. And that's just an informal get-together where we have wine and other food and we talk about a specific topic within the field. It usually has a presentation, but not always, and it'll be a group of us on the 6th floor in 66 West 12th. And I strongly recommend people come because it's definitely a way to continue professional development once you've graduated, as well as while you're in the program as well. It also gives you an opportunity to meet so many people. So that's one thing. We also have presentations regularly. We've got one this Thursday, which is on site. And that's a presentation about modals, see if you're interested. And I think we try and do things, at least monthly in those lines. We do an awful lot of webinars with Scott Thornbury, and we work with different organizations. We work with IATEFL because I also work for IATEFL, so it makes sense for me to connect with them and utilize their speakers. We also work with NATECLA, which is another organization, another teaching organization. So all of that is open to you, as well as our big conference, which again, Claire, you've presented at, which is...
The Meeting Challenges Exploring Solutions Conference. We host it here at the New School in October every year, right?
Yeah.
It's October again this year, right?
Yep. Yep. So that's something important to know, and the Facebook page is active, Twitter is active, our blog is very active. So as soon as you're in the program, really at the orientation stage, what we tend to do is talk about these and get you involved as much as you want to be. Obviously not to overload, to make you feel comfortable, but really to give you the opportunity, as I said, to feel very connected to the program, not only now, but once you graduated also. And I think that the community is fairly strong. I don't know how many of us were there at TESOL.
There were about about 10 at least
Yeah.
of alumni who made the connection, and we even had like a reception. We went to a restaurant near the convention hall just to say, hey, we're in the International TESOL Convention had something like 4,000 or 5,000 attendees.
Yeah.
So obviously there were a million subgroups you could visit with, but one of them was MA TESOL at the new school.
Yeah. Okay, then. So that's one thing. If we just move on. So the next thing I wanted to pull out, the thing that I think is important about the program, is the content itself. And as I said, it's got a very definite kind of slant to it, looking at English particularly, and I guess teaching as well, but English as a global language, which I started teaching 30 years ago, which clearly I started at about 2. But when I started at that point, we really talked about ownership of English. We talked about the fact that there was non-native, native speaker. We made a very definite divide. There were teachers from England, teachers from Australia, teachers from North America, and it seemed to be just about that. It was kind of isolated. And what's happened since I've been teaching is we've recognized that English has become a global language, a lingua franca, and that's brought with it a lot of different implications, not only from the content that we teach, but to a certain extent how we teach as well, but certainly our view and our aspect, how we think about the students that are in front of us, where they're situated, who they're going to be using English with. And it's less of an elitist language, which there's certainly privilege sometimes attached to learning English, but we're trying to sort of get rid of that as much as possible and see it much more as something that gives parity to people and should be as open to as many people as possible. I don't know if you agree with that, Claire, or want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, a big theme and one way of looking at English language teaching that came out at this year's TESOL convention was to think of English teaching as giving people the opportunity to be multilingual rather than using it as unfortunately, historically, it was sometimes used to wipe out native languages, home languages of people in underprivileged groups, or it was used to be, this is the dominant language of the world, so anyone who speaks it gets to have the most privileges in life. That is starting to change now because we're seeing, English really has taken over a lot. Most of the internet is only accessible to people who can read English, right? Yeah. Large majority of textbooks in the world are available, journals are available in English. So what we need to focus on is giving everyone the opportunity to access those things without saying that those things should only ever be available in English or they should be reserved only for the English-speaking elite.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that when you look very closely at, say, English as a lingua franca has been the idea of what does it mean to have correct English? What do we correct in the classroom and what should be corrected? And how important that is that given that there are more non-native speakers of English than there are native speakers of English in the world currently. And most of them are talking to other non-native speakers. They're not essentially talking to a native speaker, which means that the standard of English can be slightly different because typically what we know in the classroom is that learners usually always understand one another. It's often difficult for the teacher to understand students, but the learners often do because they're coming at it from the same sort of framework, same learning perspective. So many talks at conferences do question what that is, and you'll see it all online. So that's one thing. The other thing is the idea of coining new words and who should and who does do that. And so what I've given you now in the envelopes that again Heather's got is what we call loan words, words that are taken from English and then utilized in other languages or changed for whatever reason, and we'll look at some of the reasons in a moment. But if we just go to the next slide, what we'll see is I've asked a question, what do SELFIE and email have in common? Any ideas? And it is the idea of a global thing.
They're both transmitted electronically.
Mm-hmm, true, excellent. Think of them as words.
Electronic mail, email, selfie.
When I was in Korea, they became a thing. So it was self-camera.
Yes.
Like portmanteaus.
Well, basically, if we just, you're absolutely right, and this is maybe too smart for me, but the idea is that these two words really don't have direct translations in any language. And so actually, if you use those words in just about at the moment they're thinking about any language, obviously that's probably not the case, they'll be understood. So this moves forward the idea of coinage, but it also talks about the proliferation of words that multiple peoples recognize. And so what I'd like you to do now is look at the loan words, and in one you've got the word, and then in the other you've got the definition, and you just kind of have to match them. So I'll give you about 10 minutes to do that.
Okay. The words for those of you watching at home are colony, preponement, peña, anti-baby peel, handy, trainer, lay parking, lay smoking, Eskimo, and salaryman. And we have to match those up with their meanings. Should I give the meanings in any old random order? All right. Mobile phone, car park, parka, tuxedo, pen, to postpone something, neighborhood, coach, usually for a football team, white collar worker, and birth control pill. So each of those means something. Trick is to figure out what.
Not easy.
No.
How are we doing? We've got some really smart students.
I'm going to go see how they're doing.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, let's go through these. So the first one I want to do, if we can do, is colony. Any ideas what you thought that was? Neighborhood. Excellent. Okay. Any ideas which language that's been used in?
Or which variety of English, rather?
I always think of the 13 original colonies with the original Brexit, I suppose. The United States.
Right, so that's used in Hindi. Yes, very interesting. Very interesting, right?
Uh-huh.
There's a huge perspective on them. Okay, preponement.
What's to postpone something?
To postpone something. Okay. Penna. Pen. Anti-baby pill. Birth control. It's a bit graphic there. Okay, handy.
Mobile.
Trainer.
A coach.
The language.
Trainer.
All those three are from the same language.
Yeah.
But in British, isn't a trainer also a
Yeah.
speaker? German.
German.
Mhm.
Right, great. Okay. Le parking.
Pardon?
Le parking.
The car park.
Car park. Language.
Well, car park is British English, and le parking would be French.
French.
Mhm.
Good.
Mhm.
Okay then. So this le smoking.
That sounds French.
French. Yeah, because of the article, and it's tuxedo. Eskimo.
Parka?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And any idea about the language that's used in? It would make sense. Italian.
Really?
Yeah. Okay, then salaryman. I know, I spent a long time in Asia and know this.
White collar worker.
White collar worker. Language that it's used in?
Japanese.
Right, okay.
Mhm.
So like I said, these are loan words. So it's a little bit different from using them in a type of English. It's more likely these are words that are just used. Any idea, right? Any idea why they might be used in another language?
Pop culture, probably pulling it in.
Yeah.
Excellent, right? Yeah, that they see it on either the film, now social media, that it's being used. And social media actually is creating quite a catalyst to this idea or this kind of type of thing happening. Okay? Anything like preponement, any idea why that might be changed? Like we would typically say postponed. I think you looked at this last year.
Yeah, we examined it together.
Is it the prefix of pre, that you're planning to postpone something before the event actually happens?
Right,
Yeah.
okay, yeah. So it's the idea that you look at a word that you use from another language, and it just doesn't seem to make sense because often, actually, I work with somebody called Roshi Jolly who's from India, and she said, well, to me, it doesn't make sense when you say postpone something, because it sounds like after the event you decided, okay, we won't have it. This, though, makes more sense because you do it pre. So you pre-postpone it, if you see what I mean. I can't change the way I'm using that. So that's an interesting thing. That's a much stronger way of coining a language or coining a word and changing it, and has to do with historical perspective, because obviously the change of a word like that would take years. So that's an interesting one. Birth control pill, anti-baby.
It's very direct.
It's very direct, isn't it?
Birth control is not.
Right, exactly. So
But-
it might be the difference sort of, go ahead.
I mean, the German word for baby is not baby, right? So when they say anti-baby pill in German, they're borrowing the English word for baby and the English prefix anti
Yeah.
in order to express something which just seems very direct. So it's actually, I think possibly to native German speakers that sounds euphemistic.
Yeah.
Whereas birth control sounds...
And that's got another idea, is that often, for example, we will use French words in our language because it either is more nuanced for affect, right, stylistic. So I think that could be that,
Yeah.
that it's a slightly different feel to it. But for us, it's like, oh, okay, I know exactly what you mean. Handy?
Mobile phone, because you use it in your hand.
Yeah,
Exactly.
you hold it.
So it's the very obvious, right? It's the very obvious idea of it rather than mobile. So walking around with a handy because you're holding it. Trainer?
It's a person who trains you.
Yeah.
The ER prefix usually connotates a position.
Exactly. Okay. And it might be because this particularly, as I've said here, is usually for a football team. So to me, then again, it's got the idea of more of a global thing. I mean, football is incredibly popular. I think it's the most popular sport globally. So that makes sense to use something that everybody can identify, everybody can recognize. Le parking and le smoking, any thoughts about those two?
I was confused recently because one of my Russian students said, what's the English word for smoking? I said, you mean like... And he said, no, like the clothes you wear. And I was like, what are you talking about? But Russian has borrowed from French, which in turn borrowed from English,
Right.
the idea that le smoking equals tuxedo, evening
interesting.
jacket, right?
Yeah.
Which is funny because both French and Russian have a word for, lighting up a cigarette.
Yes.
Which is not connected to their word for tuxedo.
Yeah. So again, we're going more into this idea of style, because obviously if people are in tuxedos, do they tend to smoke? Who knows? But I mean, it is this style. Is it more nuanced? Eskimo and parka, that one's interesting to me. Why do you think that would be used? Because it's not even used for the same thing, if you see what I mean, because an Eskimo clearly isn't a coat.
I'm going to guess stereotypes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so. The idea of this huddled sort of thing, absolutely, I would say. I must admit, I mean, I that is a new one to me, because, and I know a little bit of Italian.
Well, I think I remember reading in some older English works Eskimo jacket
Yeah.
instead of parka, before the
Really?
word parka had been borrowed into English from the original Inuit.
Oh, okay.
But of course, Eskimo was a French coined term for the Inuit. They don't call themselves Eskimo.
Well, yeah,
So this
and-
is an
and actually
interesting
we
circle. This is kind of a circle from French into English, then back into Italian, with a totally different meaning each time. Right?
Okay, then, right. And then salaryman, this has been for a very long time, since I've been teaching, because I used to have to teach this. Any thoughts about that? Because you actually hear that. People will say, I am a salaryman.
Actually, salaryman makes more sense than white collar, especially as jobs tend to ebb and flow and fashions change. Because white collar connotates that you're rich enough to have white clothes to keep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
Whereas salary actually indicates very specifically that you're making enough money to be comfortable.
So again, this was another point to just bring out about the program, that actually we'll definitely, I mean, this is just a fun thing to do, and there are many, many, many more examples of not only loan words, but also varieties of English, which is something that Claire spoke to, that there are, you know, it's Hong Kongese, it's different types of Englishes. And again, when I started teaching, we didn't pluralize English. We didn't say, oh, there are Englishes. We thought that there was one. And that has definitely been a movement that's gained a lot more momentum over the last 20 years, I would say. So you will look at that in one of the core courses, particularly called English in the World, which I know Claire has taken, where you will think about what does it mean to teach English? What does it mean to think about a lingua franca? What does it mean to have a globalized language? And of course, at the moment, that's definitely something in flux. Because of Kane, there's a little bit of a backlash to the idea of globalization, given the onslaught of populism and the spread of it and what that means. But Claire, if you want to speak to English in the World a little bit.
Yeah, English in the World was a personal favorite course of mine. You know, I think it's interesting because for at least 200 years, we've been able to recognize that American English and British English are not created the same way. We've been allowed to distinguish differences of grammar, spelling, and vocabulary without there being a lot of judgment attached to it. Lift and elevator, you know, at least in America, we can understand what you meant when you said lift, right?
Yeah,
Perhaps there's a little more confusion going back the other way, but it depends on how much exposure you've had. And similarly, when you hear, you know, the jokes about Australian English simply being so clipped and short, you know, it's with a certain amount of, yeah, but it's still English. Then when you try to push it out and say, well, but Hong Kong and Singapore and India each have their own version of English. Nigeria and Kenya, South Africa have variations on English. And you try to talk about, well, how much of that grammar do we willingly accept, and how much has been considered to be like innovation or wrong, or, oh yeah, they say it that way in South Africa, but everyone in South Africa is wrong, right? Because for so many decades, the textbooks came out of the UK or the US. The majority of language samples that were distributed in movies or TVs were coming out of American or British studios. The books that were being published in the English language were primarily American, British, or Canadian. So, in a way, when I as an American was exposed to like some Singaporean version of English, I'd be like, oh, that sounds wrong. However, if you end up teaching English to a Singapore native for any reason, to them that's not wrong. That's the way their parents speak, right? So English in the World really tackled the idea, can we have any idea of standard English anymore? If there is a standard, whose standard is it? Whose interests does that standard serve? And if we're ready to let go of the standards, then what does that mean for our teaching, right? And there's a certain level of discomfort with saying we can get rid of standards, because then what are you teaching if there's nothing that's standard, right? But, you know, someone said to me, well, that just sounds messy. And I'm like, well, you know, the language of English has always been a little messy. It was cobbled together from a great variety of sources.
Like any language.
By committees that were meeting in separate centuries and on different continents, right? So, you know, embracing the mess while also trying to carve out what that means for you as a teacher is something we really work on hard in the English in the World class. And it ended up being the first class I took in the MA, which I think was very helpful for me because it helped frame future ideas very well. You know, to think about every time you're learning, oh, this technique or that technique, you have to think about, so whose interests would this approach serve in the classroom? And who came up with this idea? And does that have any implication for whether it should still be acceptable?
And I think it's always, you know, I've taught in many, many different countries. I spent a long time in Asia, for example, and it's context driven. You know, a lot of people think, oh, lingua franca, well, what do I teach now? But the reality is you teach what's in your context. So to a certain extent, it's not that difficult. It just means to be much more flexible, I think, and fluid about your thoughts in terms of, okay, as you sent the standard, and I think you've mentioned a really good point there where you said, well, whose standard does it serve? And that's a very useful type of thing to do, but also the idea that we are working with people who have an opinion about the type of language that they want to learn, and we've got to embrace that too. So it's much more about looking at the student's perspective as well and how they feel about that, and I think keeping the dialogue open. But certainly people really enjoy this class, and they'll often talk about it being very humbling, that they hadn't thought about a lot of the issues that come up, and really kind of break down a lot of your kind of ideas and sort of preconceived ideas that hopefully by the time you finish the course, and certainly by the time you finish the program, have been washed away as much as possible.
For one of the assignments in English in the World, you end up interviewing someone who is a non-native speaker, and so that was an interesting way to flip your perspective.
Yeah, exactly. So I've had, I want to hand over to Claire right now, because the other aspect of the program is the idea of how can you personalize it. Because I think once you get to a graduate degree, definitely what you're doing is you're thinking about your career, you're thinking about your thoughts, but you're also bringing a lot to the program. You're bringing your experience to the program, you're bringing your enjoyment to the program, you're bringing your specializations to the program, which might not be that clear when you begin, but certainly as you go through the program, become more evident and clearer. So I think to me it's important to allow you to grow those ideas that you come with, and as I said, personalize, so that you're not all cookie cutter, even though the New School is far from that. So I've put this up, and I'm going to hand over to Claire to explain why.
It's become something of a joke. This is Claire. She studies Star Trek, but this came my Star Trek project came out of, I was in the class Language Analysis, Phonology, Lexis, and Syntax, which is where we talk a lot about words, where words came from, where they are going, basically. One of the assignments said, find a text and look up the origins, the etymological origins of the major nouns in that text. And I happened to have on my TV at the time original series Star Trek. So I started thinking about that opening dialogue, space, the final frontier, right? And I was inspired to start doing a little research. I looked into some corpus data. If you haven't used a corpus before, don't worry, you will. But basically, I started looking at how frequently was the term final frontier, those two words together, how frequently does that appear historically? And the answer was, up until 1966, when Star Trek premiered, there were maybe 10 uses of that per decade.
Wow.
And they never meant outer space. They always meant an earthly location. They said, Afghanistan will be Great Britain's final frontier in the 1890s, for example. So I started looking at Star Trek as an example of a piece of pop culture that really was specific to the needs of the American audience at the time it was made. Was written in a very specific 1960s context, got canceled after only 3 years, and yet these words and these terms, warp speed, final frontier, beaming information around, all of those came into the language. And that matters because you will never find in an ESL textbook the definition of warp speed or an exploration of final frontier as an idiom. But it is out there. It is used in, and in my full presentation I talk about finding it in recipes online, in skincare ads, clear up your skin at warp speed, right?
Right.
Things like that. If you are someone who's trying to learn English and be comfortable navigating an online world that's in English, you're going to run into a million of these things that are from Star Trek. But of course, not only Star Trek, right? You hear enter the matrix online a lot. You hear down a rabbit hole a lot. You hear, other phrases that fall into the language like bucket list or albatross around my neck or MacGyvering, all came out of a TV show, a book, a movie, a poem, right? That was hugely influential in what would be called the inner circle, America and the UK and other, Anglophone countries. But then if you want to learn English and you aren't from one of those places, you've never seen Star Trek. You may have only watched The Matrix in a dubbed version. You've definitely never heard of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner or what an albatross stands for in that poem, right? So I ended up starting out with that one course assignment and then being encouraged to develop it for a convention presentation, this whole research on what does pop culture do for English and what does that mean about what pop culture could do for the English classroom. So yes, it started with Star Trek, but I am a little bit of a nerd that way, but we did end up finding a lot of interesting data on how culture really shapes us and the way we speak.
Right, excellent. So that was a particular type of project, and I think there are multiple since I've been working with students myself. They might be more defined to teaching. That could be curriculum development. It could be corrective feedback, which was an area I researched, and so I've worked with multiple students on that, where they've picked a particular type of language. But as I said, it's really something that drives you. It's passionate. We've had one person just in the last year publish a book based on what she came up with, and that actually over the 11 years of the program has happened repeatedly. But I think what it does is it really sort of gets you into the program in a different way. It gets you to think about how you can contribute to the program, because I think one of the things I noticed with you, Claire, is it's actually giving back, because now you're not only doing it for yourself, but then you go on to present at Meeting Challenges, which is our conference, then TESOL, and multiple other places where it just starts to sort of trickle through. And I think it's very unusual to do Star Trek, and that just naturally grabs people. And it did make me sort of suddenly go, and I remember after I'd seen your first presentation and then I saw it on TV and I was like, see, I know. So, right, so yeah, but and I think it also brings up just another incidental in that culture molds us, it molds how we speak, and it's this kind of ongoing thing, and it's just fun when you start teaching language, looking at that and thinking about the vocabulary that you teach, the idiomatic language you teach, and where it comes from.
Yeah, and it shapes us in ways we don't even realize. I've done the presentation and have had people say to me, wait, bucket list was from a movie?
Yeah.
Or like, wait, what did we used to call coming up with solutions before MacGyver premiered? Because that was only 1986. We must have had a word before that, right? Which we did, but it's been completely forgotten in favor of this cultural illusion, right?
Right. Interesting. So any questions about that? As I said, there's professional projects, but there's also projects within courses where you can determine how much you'd like to do a specific type of thing. Is that quite clear? So we're going to round off then with just another thing, the final thing, this idea of experiential learning, which is absolutely the cornerstone of everything we do. Because we believe strongly that you learn by doing, especially developing you as a teacher, and honing your skill and honing your craft, and really allowing you to be in the classroom with students, practicing different techniques or different ideas, different lesson plan types that you've had from input sessions. So within the summer, particularly, it's very obvious because we have the outreach students who come to us. There's usually anything from 100 to 150. We've actually got, one year it was 180. And these are language learners who are in areas that are underserved. So immigrants, migrants, asylum seekers, refugees. And you as MA TESOL students will teach them based on what you've learned in the input sessions from the methods classes. Now we do it very obviously in the summer, but then we continue it in the fall and the spring, that if students are on site, they teach in the outreach. And we work with Sanctuary for Families, we work with the Go Project, we work with lots of different organizations that basically need our help. Because I think, it's a win-win. The idea is to give you practical hands-on training so that you can develop as a teacher, which is absolutely what happens. We're giving back to a community that we know wouldn't normally be able to afford quality, constant, reliable English language classes, because there are many resources in the city, but quality sometimes can be a question. So that's as I said, it's a win-win for us. We have an outreach coordinator, Roshi Jolly, who would work with you from the orientation stage to say, do you feel that you want to either tutor, do you want to teach one-on-one, do you want to take on a full class, do you want to work with a colleague, all of those different gradations to make sure that you don't feel like you're being thrown in, but that you really get experience in a way that you want to and that benefits you and of course the students too. And we provide support in terms of the curriculum and also lesson plan. So let me hand over, because again, Claire has taught with us many times.
When I came into this program for, as my first year, I was working full-time, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and then I was going to grad school at night. So I said, my day job doesn't involve teaching. Where am I going to get this? You need to be teaching in order to really implement some of the assignments being given.
Right.
So Roshi helped me find a Saturday morning teaching opportunity with the Go Project. It was located in 10th Avenue and 25th Street in Manhattan. And basically, the general program was a weekend academy for students in underperforming public schools. Many of their parents were sitting there in the waiting room chattering to each other in Spanish, Mandarin, Cantonese, right? And having very limited English, and knowing that part of the reason their children struggle in school is that they themselves have trouble advocating for their children, have trouble helping with homework because they aren't fluent in the language of instruction, right? So basically we would just bring them all into a classroom, and it was kind of bare bones ESL because we didn't have an assigned textbook. We didn't necessarily have any of the frills and whistles like access to PowerPoints or projectors or anything like that. So instead, we worked together on building a curriculum. So one student, I said to her day one, "What's your goal?" She said, "I want to be able to leave Chinatown and not be worried I'll get lost." So the next 2 weekends, it was us with the map of the subway station and recordings of subway announcements, and we were working on how do you find your way to anywhere in the city, right? We had one person say, "My kid told me today was a holiday, but it doesn't seem like a holiday. All the banks are open." So we did a reading about St. Patrick's Day and what that means to Americans, right? And compared it to other cultural holidays like Halloween, which have come in. I think the beauty of it was we were able to be New York City specific. We were able to give people the tools they will specifically need to live in this city. Many books, and nothing against textbooks, but they have to give you pretty vague, like getting around town might be how to get to the hospital or the supermarket. We do not have the hospital in New York City. We do not have the supermarket. We have 1 million markets and about 10,000 hospitals, but most of them are owned by the same 3 companies, right? So we were able to kind of put our own spin on that. Like one of the activities I found online for clothing was talking about like what clothing does women wear and what clothing do men wear. And one woman said, in New York City, everybody wears everything. Right. This question makes no sense to me. So we were able to say like, okay, so forget this textbook then. Let's just talk about how language is used in your community, in your city, and with your children that you have to send to their schools. What do you need to know to make that happen? And I mean, unfortunately, you only get so many hours, so obviously that was a massive project to tackle, but the students and I had some very productive sessions based around that theme.
Right. And I think that's so the great points that you've brought up about the idea of a responsive, reactive curriculum. Because, there's 1,000,001 course books in this field, and they're all, published by amazing writers quite often, but it's you in the classroom with your group of people in front of you. And so the skill to develop is not only your techniques, how am I going to concept check, how am I going to ask questions, how am I going to make sure that I don't talk too much, all of those techniques that we think are critical, and then obviously the lesson plan, but then also the skills of being able to think, okay, well, this particular person needs this, how can I work this in to the curriculum that I'm going to create. And so I think reactive is a great way to talk about it, and I talk a lot in the practicum, for example, with students about this, in that it's, you might be going in one direction, but if something happens, you've got to be able to change track, and you've got to be able to embrace that, which isn't always easy, and it does mean that you've got to be, again, flexible. So there's another thing that we often talk about. If we looked at the overarching aim of the whole program, it would be that you would become, by the end of the program, an adaptive, reflective practitioner. So adaptive to the context, to the students that you've got in front of you, on a micro level, i.e. you're in the class and you're working with the students and changing lots of different things, you're reflecting on your action. And then a larger scale that you're developing a curriculum, you're thinking about the context, you're thinking about language. And then I think, finally, the idea of reflective, in that it really goes hand in hand with experiential, that when you experience something, the only reason that works is because you can reflect on it, which then means you articulate your experience that you've had, how it's changed you, how it's informing what you're doing, and you then take that forward. So I think that's all that I want to say. Gabriella, do you want to say anything? Okay. So questions, I think.
Anybody excited?
Very.
Yeah, really excited. Do you think that you will work with the outreach or work in the outreach?
I hope so.
Yeah.
My personal concern is I know I already have 2 teaching jobs at the same time.
Yeah, a lot of our students.
Yeah, yeah.
But I hope to in the summer.
Definitely, yeah. And usually we think that the commitment is anything from as little as 1 hour per week, but if you did that, you'd be working with a co-teacher, because typically our classes are 2 hours long every week. And, you know, another thing that you mentioned, Claire, is we only have a certain amount of hours because we've got to work with organisations. We've also got to work with the students. They have very little time. They're quite transient. They're often, you know, working and then getting jobs. So it's a little bit more critical to make sure every lesson counts, kind of thing. But yeah, that would be the kind of commitment that we would hope for. And I think, you know, thinking about experience, many of the people who join our join the program as a whole don't have much experience. And I think that's another thing that brings to the whole program itself, in that you might have in a class somebody who's been teaching for 10 years and another person who is new to the field and thinking about it. And the interesting thing is they both learn from one another. Yeah. There's something to be gained by having that person in the class and having the rich kind of combination.